Welcome! In this video we will look further into the creation and use of dynamic link libraries with the PowerBasic Windows compiler. This is where we left our code in the last video, with a small function sitting inside a dynamic link library to display the day of the week that the DLL had actually been compiled. What we're going to do today is to add a second DLL. What this DLL is going to do is it's going to allow you to call a function within the DLL to display a custom message box. So the first thing to do is we will create a new template for our DLL. Go up to the toolbar and click on DLL framework using libmain. And there is our code, and we're going to save that. Into our code, and we're going to call that PBUtils. Now in this DLL we're going to call a function, but we're going to call it passing parameters. So we have a look at our main application. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new declare statement. Now this declare statement is going to call a new function called funMessageBox. This will be contained within a DLL called PBUtils. We're going to be passing it the handle of the dialog we're currently in, which will either be the desktop or form. We then want to pass the title of the dynamic dialog, the message we want to appear in the dialog, a list of delimited button names, because there can be one, two, or many buttons on this form, the icon to actually use on the dialog, and which of the buttons is to be considered to be the default button, if any. Now once we call this function, I'd like this function to return the value of the text on the button. So let's create that function in our code. I'll fold this around to make it a little more readable. There are all our parameters. The handle of the dialog that's calling this function, the title of our new dialog, the message contained within the dialog, the delimited list of buttons to appear on the dialog, the icon number to use, and the default button if there's going to be one. And we're setting this to export from the DLL as a string. Now in order to have some documentation, we're just going to put in some text to explain what each of the parameters is actually doing, which is always useful when you come back to your project in 6 months' time to make a change, to know what it's actually doing. So the first parameter is indeed the handle to the owner form calling this routine. The title is a simple string, which is a caption. The message is the text message that we wish to appear in our message box. The buttons we wish to appear is a delimited list, which is pipe delimited between each button, and an and sign at the beginning of each word. So in this particular case there would be 3 buttons, an OK, a yes, and a maybe. The pipe delimited string is designed so that you can have 1 or possibly 2 words on each button. The default button number is the button number of the default button. For example, button 1, button 2, and button 3. And the function will return this name as a return of the function, so that the calling code can determine which button the user has actually clicked on. This will allow you to use this function within all of your applications, even those which are not PowerBasic. So, since we're going to be using icons, we'll need to set up some icons in our code. So we have some globals we'll want to put in first of all, and these are globals going to be used within the DLL itself to handle the creation and the sizing of the dialog. And I'm also putting an option in to create a font so our text on the dialog can be bigger than the default. Now we're optionally going to create 4 different icons the user can have on their dialog, just the basic ones, and we're going to set those up as constants: the critical, the information, the question, and the exclamation. And to make it easier, I've created 4 icons for each of those: a critical one, an exclamation, an information, and a question. You can of course add your own custom ones, and we're going to add those to the resource using the #resource command. Now if we did a quick compile on that just to make sure our code is robust, which it is, what we can do inside the libmain function, which is the first function called in the DLL, there's a DLL process attach. So what we'll want to put in there is a command to create our font. So we'll use the font new command, specifying the Verdana font, 12 point, and with all the defaults. And we're passing that back to the global we created called hfont. Now once the DLL actually detaches, we'll want the font to have ended to clean up the memory for it, so using the font end command. So if we go back to our main function, what we're going to be doing is creating basically a dynamic dialog. Now in order to do this, there are a fair number of local variables we'll have to create to keep track of what we're actually doing. We'll cover these actually as we go. Now the first thing you want to do is some error handling. Obviously, since you're creating the DLL and you may well be passing this DLL on to other people to actually use, you have to assume that they may make errors in calling your function. Therefore you have to check for errors. For example, if they give you an empty len string for the buttons to appear in the dialog, since we're not going to give the user any X object on the dialog to close the dialog without clicking a button, if there are no buttons, they would effectively have a dialog on screen that could not be exited from. So if there are no buttons, then we'll exit straight away. Now obviously that'll handle if there's no buttons. If there's no message or no title, we'll have to do something remarkably similar. However, if we get this far, there at least are buttons, so we'll put a no title or no message on the screen. Now if the user is actually passing as an icon, is basically an icon number, we want to pick up the icon number and set our image accordingly. So if they send a 1, we're assuming it's an exclamation, 2 for stop, 3 for information, 4 for question, and if they pass any other number, we will default to the information icon. Now we come to the handling of the buttons. Again, we want to work out how many buttons there actually are by using the parseCount command, one of our string handling functions, looking at the pipe delimiter and checking to see how many there actually are. If the default button the user has actually specified is greater than the number of buttons we actually have, or if the default button is actually a minus number, then we exit straight away because they're giving us values we cannot handle. The next thing we want to do is do some preparation on the dialog itself. First of all, to work out where in the dialog we're going to start placing buttons, making it far enough over so we can still get our icon in, and setting the size of the buttons accordingly. If you think these values are too small or too large, please feel free to amend the code. I'm putting a small amount of space between each button to ensure that they're not crowded in. And we're working out what the maximum number of characters per line are. Again, this is just purely for aesthetics. If the user gives a long message to appear on the dialog, we still want it to appear reasonably sensibly. Next is to work out what the minimum dialog width is going to be. Working out based on the number of buttons multiplied by the button width, and adding on to that the button separation. So if we'll put that in as a piece of code here, plus another 25 just to give us a margin. Now we want to work out the initial height of the label we're going to be put onto the screen that contains our message. And in here we're actually using the round command for the first time. The round command allows you to round numbers up. Putting the slash this way as opposed to this way means although it is a division, it's an integer division. Therefore you do not keep the remainder. Now if there are any carriage returns in the text they've given us for the message, then we want to increase the height of our text variable, which will effectively resize the dialog. Now, having got all that, we need to work out how big the form actually has to be. Now again, we're working on the number of buttons. If it's greater than 3, or if it's less than 3, and we've got a new function here called recenter buttons. Now, I'll put this in shortly. While this isn't recentering the buttons, it's working out where the buttons actually need to go. And if the text the user is given for a message is quite long, we need to make an adjustment again to make sure that our dialog width is sufficient to cope with this. Now we've worked all that out, we can start to actually build our dialog. Now we're using a handle number starting at the value 1000. Because there are a number of different objects going to appear on the screen here, we're going to start with 1000 and then increment it for each one we put onto the screen, setting the X position of the first button to appear, and we're using a button counter variable to keep track of how many buttons we've actually done. Now we can add a code which actually creates the dialog based on the payment handle, the title the user's provided, the dialog width and height we have previously worked out, and we want to make this a modal frame. We want to center it, we want to make it the topmost window so it appears on top of all other windows. Having done that, the next task is to add a label for our message, in this case with the value 2000 as its handle. And we'll just fold this code round so you can see it. So it's taking the message the user's given us, it's working out the dialog width, taking 40 of it to give us a nice wee border, and the height of the text which we worked out. Now having got the height of the text the user puts on screen, we then determine the height of the text so we know where to begin the buttons, so that the buttons and the text do not overwrite each other. So next we can reset the starting Y position of the buttons to be the text height we worked out, plus a small margin of 5 dialog units, and then resize the dialog to accommodate this greater height. Now we can start adding the image, which is the icon the user has selected, using the control add image command, and our handle of 2010 for the str image which we've already populated, and its position on screen, which in this case is fixed. Now we have a variable number of buttons to put onto the screen, so this will have to be a loop. So we're going to use a do loop in this case, and we're picking up the button name from our str buttons variable, which contains the list of all the buttons, and we're incrementing the starter handle, which is the handle for our button. Now we're going to add the button at the calculated position. First of all, we're testing if the button counter happens to be the default button. If it is, then we add the BS default with a tab stop. Otherwise, all other buttons just have the tab stop. Now having got that, we can actually add the button. And we'll fold this code around so you can see it easier. So it's a standard control add button command, dialog handle, the handle of the button itself, which we've calculated, the text on the button, the X and Y coordinates of the button on the screen, the button width and the button height, with the style being either tab stop or tab stop in default. And having done that, we can then advance the button counter, because we have now completed work on this button. And we need to recalculate where the next button is actually going to appear on the screen by adding on the button width and the button separation. So long begin X will contain the X position of the new button. And having completed everything on that button, we then want a loop command that will test to see if our button counter is actually greater than the number of buttons. If so, it will drop out of the loop. If not, it will continue and do the next button. Now, since we've created a dialog which is of variable size, depending on what we've been given, we want to center the window on the screen. So we're going to call one of the Windows API routines to center the window. And the very last thing we'll do is resize the dialog. Now, if we actually have a default button, we want to set the focus to the default button, so that if the user presses the return button, the default button will effectively be taken. So we're using the control set focus command based on our default button number, which will be either 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on how many buttons we've got, plus the 1000. And we're going to give it a black border by using the control send command to set the style. Having done all that, we will want to set the font on the message the user has provided to the font we have selected, and then the final touch is to show the dialog modally on screen. And we're declaring that we have a callback function to handle that, which we will see after a moment. Now, it's always possible that the user has just pressed the return button and there is no default. So we'll put a command in to handle this. No, I'm using the goto command, which is technically frowned upon in basic programming, but it does work as long as it's not used too often. So if the default button is 0 and the result's 1, then there's no set default and the return basically has been pressed. Therefore, we pop back up to the dialog start command, which, if you look up, I've declared a label up here with the colon after it, which is the position in the code that it will actually jump to. And after this, another piece of code to work out the result is greater than 1000, so it is a handle. So we take off the starter handle, work out the number we've got, and we know the default button accordingly. And the final thing to do is to work out the name on the button that your user has actually clicked on. And this command in here will do exactly that. What we're doing here is we're taking the str buttons, which is the list of the buttons to appear on the screen. We're parsing it on the pipe command for the long result. We're trimming it, and then we're using the remove. This will return the name of the button. And then our final act in this function is to return that value. Now, if we compile now, it will quite correctly tell us we haven't done the recenter buttons function yet. Therefore, what we want to do, we want to create that function. This takes in the number of buttons as the parse count. It takes the starting, the button separation, and the button width. And then based on the number of buttons, either 1 or 2, this is a special handler for where there's only 1 or 2 buttons on the screen. This will work out what the starting locations are and possible change to the button separation. And the final routine, which we're going to put in, is a subroutine rather than a function. And this is the one I've created effectively to recenter the window given its handle. This is using some Windows API calls to work out the size of the window. and get the system metrics of the screen that you happen to be on and set the window position basically to the calculated coordinates. So we compile this now. Oh yes, we haven't created the event handler yet. That's the other thing we still have to do. So let's go down to the bottom of our code and we'll create a callback function which is going to handle all our events. This is a very straightforward callback function. It's using one local variable called longMessage, which is a long. It's picking up the fact that you have in fact clicked on a button. So all we have to do is to work out which button you've actually clicked on. So the long message is picking up the control handle of that button, and then it's closing the dialog and passing back that number. So that will be 1001, 1002, 1003, depending on how many buttons you've actually got. And that should be us done. Yes, it is. Right, having completed the creation of our DLL, which we have a look at the code, there's the PBUtils DLL now being created. So how are we going to call it? If we look at our main application, we've already declared the function, but we haven't actually called it yet. So what we're going to do is, after we've displayed the message box to say day information, which works out the compilation date and displays the day, we're going to create another local variable to pick up our return value, because this function will return a value, and we're going to call our fun message box with our parameters. Now if we look at the parameters we're expecting to have, these are the parameters we're going to give it. The handle of the dialog, we don't actually have a dialog going on here, so we'll just use effectively the desktop handle, which is 0. The title we want in our custom dialog, which in this case we'll say, we will say query the day. We can then ask a question, and we want to give the user some buttons. And these are pipe delimited. Now if we wanted to have more than one line of text in a dialog, which is what we'll do, we want to add on to this carriage return line fade, and we will add on a piece of instruction we can give to user, like so. Now our icon is going to be a number, and what we were going to do in this one is, to make life easier for us, we will create an enumeration which will allow us to use these as constants. So since we're going to be using a question, we will put this icon in as so, with the percentage at the beginning. So basically it's a constant. And our default button, we will go for number 1, the first button. So to pick up the return value, we'll want to display a message box with our return value. So we try running that code now. We get the return from the first DLL to say that the compilation date is Saturday. And we get a dialog showing 3 buttons as expected, the workday, the rest day and the holiday, with the heavy border around the workday which shows it's the default. We have our text as expected in 2 lines in a larger font. If we just hit return here, it returns the value of the default button, which is workday. If we have a 0 for our default button and try running that now, again it will not let you pick by default. You have to click on one of them, which we do. So if we want to add more buttons, let's assume we wanted to add another couple of buttons. How would that behave? Well, the dialog would just get bigger. So we now have 5 buttons on the screen. So what we've created is a DLL with a small function which will create a dynamic dialog, which allows you to ask questions that have more than the yes, no, cancel, retry type options on the normal message box. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.